Hey everyone. Tonight we begin with something that might sound impossibly romantic, until you realize just how terrifying it actually was. We're diving into the world of ancient mariners who sailed into absolute darkness with nothing but the stars, the wind, and centuries of hard-won wisdom to guide them home. These weren't casual weekend sailors. These were people who staked their lives on reading the night sky like a map written in a language most of us have completely forgotten. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship in the year 800 CE, somewhere in the Mediterranean Sea. The sun disappeared hours ago, taking with it any familiar landmarks, any sense of direction, any comfort that comes from seeing where you're going. The only sounds are the creaking of timber, the splash of waves against the hull, and the gentle flapping of sails catching wind you can feel but cannot see. Above you stretches an endless canopy of stars so bright and numerous that modern city dwellers can barely imagine their brilliance. But here's the thing. Those stars aren't just beautiful. They're your only hope of survival. The captain beside you isn't panicking. He's not even particularly concerned. Instead, he's studying the heavens with the focused attention of someone reading a detailed instruction manual. Because that's exactly what he's doing. To him, the night sky isn't a mysterious void. It's a navigation system more reliable than anything we use today, more precise than GPS, more trustworthy than any compass. He knows which star rises at exactly the same time the sun sets during the spring equinox. He can tell you what constellation will be directly overhead at midnight 3 weeks from now. He understands the relationship between the moon's phase and the height of tomorrow's tide with mathematical precision that would impress modern astronomers. This wasn't luck or instinct. This was science. Ancient science, passed down through generations of sailors who learned that the difference between reading the stars correctly and getting it wrong was often the difference between returning home with a ship full of goods and disappearing forever into the vast darkness of the open ocean. What most people don't realize is that navigation by night was actually preferred by many ancient mariners. Daylight might seem safer to us, but it presented its own challenges. The sun's glare made it difficult to spot distant landmarks. Heat created atmospheric distortions that could make islands appear closer or farther than they actually were. Coastal winds often died down during the day, leaving ships becalmed and vulnerable. But night brought clarity. The stars were fixed reference points that never lied about direction. The cooler air often carried steady winds that could push a ship forward at consistent speeds. And perhaps, most importantly, night sailing meant arriving at destinations during daylight hours, when it was actually safe to navigate into unfamiliar harbors. The techniques these ancient mariners developed were staggeringly sophisticated. They didn't just look up at the sky and hope for the best. They had developed systematic methods for reading celestial movements that remained largely unchanged for over 1,000 years. These weren't primitive guessing games. They were precise scientific procedures that required years of training to master and a lifetime of practice to perfect. Let's start with the most fundamental skill every ancient navigator had to learn: finding north. Today we take this for granted. Pull out a compass, and the needle points north. Simple, but imagine you're floating in the middle of an ocean with no magnetic compass, no GPS, no landmarks of any kind. How do you determine which direction is north when every direction looks exactly the same? The answer lies in understanding one crucial astronomical fact. While all the other stars appear to move across the sky throughout the night, there's one star that stays put. The North Star, or Polaris, sits almost directly above the Earth's North Pole, which means it remains stationary while every other star in the sky rotates around it. Find that star, and you've found true north. But here's where it gets interesting. The North Star that we use today wasn't the North Star that ancient mariners used. Due to a phenomenon called axial precession, the Earth's rotational axis slowly wobbles over a period of about 26,000 years. This means that the star that appears to sit directly above the North Pole changes over time. In 3000 BCE, the pole star was Thuban in the constellation Draco. By 1000 CE, there was actually no bright star close enough to the celestial North Pole to serve as a reliable marker. Navigators had to use other methods to find their direction. This is where the real genius of ancient navigation becomes apparent. Rather than relying on a single star, experienced mariners learned to read entire constellations as directional guides. They understood that certain star patterns rose in the east at predictable times and set in the west according to reliable schedules. They memorized which constellations appeared directly overhead when sailing specific routes. They could estimate their latitude by measuring the height of certain stars above the horizon. The Vikings, perhaps the most famous night sailors in history, developed particularly ingenious methods for navigation during their legendary voyages across the North Atlantic. They understood that Iceland always lay beneath a specific star when approached from Norway. They knew that Greenland could be reached by sailing toward another set of stellar landmarks. When Eric the Red's son Leif Erikson sailed to what we now know as North America around 1000 CE, he wasn't just hoping to stumble across new land. He was following star patterns that had been carefully observed and recorded by previous generations of explorers. But stellar navigation wasn't just about knowing which stars pointed in which directions. Ancient mariners also had to understand timing. The night sky changes constantly. Stars that are visible in winter disappear in summer. Constellations that rise early in the evening during one season won't appear until nearly dawn during another. A navigation technique that worked perfectly in March might be completely useless in September. This meant that every competent navigator had to carry in his head a detailed calendar of stellar movements. He needed to know not just which stars indicated north, but when those stars would be visible, how high they would climb above the horizon, and how their positions related to the seasons, the phases of the moon, and even the time of night. The Polynesians, who navigated across thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean using only traditional methods, developed perhaps the most sophisticated stellar navigation system in human history. Their navigators, known as wayfinders, underwent decades of training to memorize what they called star compasses. These weren't physical instruments, but mental maps that divided the horizon into segments marked by the rising and setting points of specific stars. A Polynesian wayfinder could tell you that if you wanted to sail from Tahiti to Hawaii, you should head toward the point on the horizon where the star Arcturus rises during certain months of the year. He knew that the Southern Cross indicated the direction toward New Zealand when observed from the Central Pacific. He understood that the constellation Orion's position could tell him whether he was sailing too far north or south of his intended course. What makes this even more remarkable is that these navigators were working with tools and knowledge that seem almost impossibly simple by modern standards. They didn't have charts in the sense that we understand them. Instead, they used stick charts, ingenious constructions made from bamboo or other materials that represented wave patterns and currents rather than land masses. The intersections of sticks showed where different swells met, indicating the presence of islands that might be beyond the horizon. But even these physical aids were secondary to the navigator's primary tool, which was his trained memory. A master wayfinder could hold in his head detailed information about hundreds of stars, their seasonal movements, their relationships to each other, and their practical applications for finding specific destinations across thousands of miles of empty ocean. The training required to become such a navigator was intense and began in childhood. Young boys destined for careers at sea would spend years memorizing star names, learning to recognize subtle differences between similar constellations, and practicing the mental calculations necessary to determine position and course from stellar observations. They would lie on their backs for hours at night, studying the sky until they could identify any star or constellation from memory, regardless of weather conditions or atmospheric clarity. This wasn't just academic knowledge. It was survival information that would be tested under the most challenging possible conditions. When you're sailing across open ocean at night, with waves crashing over the deck and wind howling through the rigging, you don't have the luxury of consulting reference books or taking time to think through your calculations. You need to be able to look up at the sky and instantly know where you are and where you need to go. The physical demands of night sailing added another layer of complexity to these navigation challenges. Ancient ships weren't equipped with the comfortable amenities we associate with modern vessels. There were no heated cabins, no electric lights, no weather-tight compartments. Sailors spent their nights on deck, exposed to whatever weather conditions they encountered, trying to maintain their watch duties while dealing with cold, wet, and often dangerous working conditions. Yet, somehow, these mariners managed to make accurate astronomical observations under circumstances that would challenge even modern navigators with sophisticated instruments. They learned to compensate for the motion of the ship when taking star sights. They developed techniques for estimating stellar positions even when clouds partially obscured the sky. They could make reasonably accurate calculations of their position even when fatigue, cold, and stress made concentration difficult. The tools they used were remarkably simple yet surprisingly effective. A piece of string with knots tied at specific intervals could serve as a crude but functional instrument for measuring the height of stars above the horizon. A bowl of water could create an artificial horizon for taking stellar observations when the actual horizon was obscured by waves or weather. A stick held at arm's length could help estimate angles between different celestial objects. But perhaps the most important tool was something that couldn't be packed in a sea chest or purchased from an instrument maker. It was knowledge. Generations of accumulated wisdom about how the sea behaved, how the stars moved, how weather patterns developed, and how all these factors interacted with each other to create the complex environment that sailors had to navigate successfully. This knowledge was passed down through apprenticeship systems that created bonds between experienced navigators and young sailors that often lasted for decades. A master navigator didn't just teach his apprentices which stars to watch or how to calculate their position. He shared the subtle indicators that could mean the difference between a safe voyage and disaster. How to read the color of water to determine depth. How to interpret the flight patterns of seabirds to locate distant land. How to use the sound and feel of waves to navigate in complete darkness. Ancient mariners understood that successful navigation required more than just knowing where you were at any given moment. They had to anticipate where currents might push them off course, how changing weather might affect their progress, and whether their intended destination would still be reachable given the supplies and time they had available. This kind of strategic thinking required a deep understanding of how different navigation factors influenced each other. The phase of the moon affected not just the amount of light available for stellar observations, but also the height of tides, which could determine whether certain harbors were accessible. Seasonal wind patterns influenced both sailing speed and the visibility of different star groups. The time of year affected everything from water availability to the likelihood of encountering storms. The complexity of these calculations would have overwhelmed most modern sailors. Yet ancient navigators performed them routinely, often while dealing with conditions that would test the limits of human endurance. Picture yourself trying to determine your exact position while standing on a deck that's pitching and rolling in heavy seas, with spray soaking your clothes and wind threatening to knock you off balance. Now, imagine doing this using only your memory of star positions and some basic measuring techniques, knowing that a mistake could doom everyone aboard your vessel. What made this possible was a form of training that modern education has largely abandoned. Ancient navigators didn't just learn facts about astronomy and seamanship, they developed what we might call embodied knowledge, information that became so deeply integrated into their physical and mental responses that they could access it instantly, even under extreme stress. A master navigator could feel changes in wind direction through his skin, detect shifts in wave patterns through the soles of his feet, and read the night sky with the same fluency that we read street signs. This integration of knowledge and instinct was crucial, because night sailing often demanded split-second decisions based on incomplete information. When storm clouds suddenly obscured your primary navigation stars, you needed to instantly shift to backup methods without losing track of your position or course. When unexpected currents began pushing your ship off its intended path, you had to quickly calculate new headings using whatever celestial reference points remained visible. The psychological challenges of night navigation were perhaps even more demanding than the technical ones. Imagine the mental discipline required to maintain confidence in your calculations when you're surrounded by darkness, with no way to verify your position until dawn reveals whether you've been sailing toward safety or toward disaster. Ancient mariners had to develop an almost supernatural trust in their own abilities and in the navigation methods they'd learned from their predecessors. This trust wasn't blind faith. It was confidence built through years of experience that had proven these techniques reliable under countless different conditions. A navigator knew that his methods worked because he'd used them successfully dozens or hundreds of times before. He'd seen other experienced sailors use the same techniques to bring their ships safely home from voyages that had seemed impossible. He understood that while individual calculations might contain small errors, the overall system was robust enough to compensate for minor mistakes through cross-checking and redundancy. The social dynamics aboard ancient ships during night voyages created their own unique challenges and opportunities. Night watches were typically organized so that the most experienced navigators were always on duty during the darkest hours, but this meant that knowledge transfer had to happen under difficult conditions. A senior sailor might be trying to teach a young apprentice how to read subtle star positions while both men were struggling to maintain their footing on a wet, moving deck in near total darkness. These teaching moments were precious because they represented some of the only times when practical navigation skills could be demonstrated and practiced. During daylight hours, sailors were usually busy with other duties like maintaining equipment, adjusting sails, or managing cargo. Night watches provided the focused time necessary for passing along the complex knowledge that kept ships moving safely through the darkness. The apprenticeship system that governed this knowledge transfer was remarkably sophisticated. Young sailors didn't just observe experienced navigators at work. They were gradually given increasing levels of responsibility as their skills developed. A beginner might start by simply helping to hold measuring instruments or keeping track of time during stellar observations. As his knowledge grew, he might be trusted to take basic star sights under supervision. Eventually, he would be allowed to make independent calculations and compare his results with those of his mentor. This gradual progression ensured that navigation knowledge was thoroughly tested and refined before it was fully passed on to the next generation. Mistakes made during the learning process could be caught and corrected by experienced supervisors. Techniques that proved unreliable under certain conditions could be modified or abandoned before they caused serious problems. The cumulative wisdom of generations of sailors was constantly being updated and improved through this hands-on teaching process. The cultural significance of stellar navigation extended far beyond its practical applications. In many seafaring societies, master navigators held positions of tremendous respect and authority. Their knowledge was considered sacred, and the rituals surrounding navigation often blended practical technique with spiritual observance. Before beginning a voyage, navigators might perform ceremonies designed to ensure favorable conditions and accurate observations. During the voyage, they might maintain specific rituals for taking star sights or calculating position. These spiritual elements weren't mere superstition. They served important psychological functions that helped navigators maintain the mental clarity and confidence necessary for their demanding work. The ceremonies created a sense of connection to successful navigators of the past, reinforcing the reliability of traditional methods. The rituals provided structure and focus during stressful moments when clear thinking was crucial for survival. Different cultures developed their own unique approaches to integrating spiritual and practical elements of navigation. Polynesian wayfinders understood their work as a form of communion with ancestral spirits who guided them across the ocean. Viking navigators saw their skills as gifts from gods who controlled the winds and waves. Arab sailors combined astronomical knowledge with religious obligations, timing their prayers to coincide with stellar observations. These cultural frameworks provided more than just emotional comfort. They created systematic approaches to navigation that helped ensure consistency and accuracy. When specific procedures were invested with sacred significance, sailors were more likely to follow them precisely, reducing the chance of errors that could result from shortcuts or improvisation. The seasonal rhythms that governed ancient maritime trade created predictable patterns in night navigation requirements. Certain times of year were favored for specific voyages because the stellar configurations were most favorable for those routes. Merchants and ship captains planned their schedules around these astronomical calendars, timing their departures to take advantage of optimal navigation conditions. Spring voyages often relied on different star patterns than autumn expeditions. Summer navigation techniques had to account for the shorter nights and different stellar visibility that characterized those months. Winter sailing, while often avoided due to rough weather, offered its own advantages for navigators who understood how to exploit the longer periods of darkness and the bright star patterns that dominated winter skies. These seasonal variations meant that a complete navigator needed to master multiple sets of techniques, each optimized for different times of year. A sailor who was expert at summer navigation might struggle during winter voyages if he hadn't learned the different stellar patterns and calculation methods that were most effective during those months. The most skilled navigators were those who could adapt their techniques seamlessly to whatever seasonal conditions they encountered. The geographic variations in navigation techniques were equally complex. Methods that worked perfectly in the Mediterranean might be completely useless in the North Atlantic. Star patterns that provided reliable guidance in tropical waters could be invisible or misleading at higher latitudes. Ocean currents, prevailing winds, and weather patterns varied dramatically between different sailing regions, requiring navigators to master location-specific knowledge for every area where they planned to operate. This geographic specialization led to the development of distinct navigation traditions in different parts of the world. Northern European sailors became experts at dealing with the challenging conditions of high-latitude sailing, where summer nights were brief and winter darkness seemed endless. Mediterranean navigators perfected techniques for coastal sailing in relatively calm waters with predictable weather patterns. Arab navigators developed methods optimized for the monsoon-driven trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean. Each of these traditions represented centuries of accumulated experience with specific environmental conditions. The knowledge was precisely adapted to local requirements. incorporating understanding of regional star visibility, seasonal weather patterns, and geographic features that could serve as navigation aids. A navigator trained in one tradition might struggle significantly when trying to apply his techniques in unfamiliar waters where different methods were required. The economic implications of successful night navigation were enormous. Ships that could sail safely in darkness could complete voyages faster, avoid dangerous daylight hours in hostile waters, and arrive at their destinations at optimal times for conducting business. Merchants who employed skilled navigators gained significant competitive advantages over rivals who were limited to daylight sailing, or who suffered frequent navigation errors that delayed their schedules. These economic pressures drove continuous improvement in navigation techniques. Ship owners invested heavily in training skilled navigators and rewarded them well for their expertise. Competition between different trading companies led to innovation in navigation methods, as each group sought advantages that would improve their success rates and reduce their losses. The value placed on navigation skills created career paths that could elevate talented sailors to positions of considerable wealth and social status. A master navigator might command compensation comparable to that of ship captains or merchant princes. His reputation could determine whether trading expeditions succeeded or failed, making his knowledge a valuable commodity that was carefully guarded and selectively shared. The international nature of maritime trade meant that navigation knowledge flowed between different cultures through contact between sailors from various backgrounds. Techniques developed by Arab navigators might be adopted by European sailors who encountered them in Mediterranean ports. Polynesian methods could influence Asian navigation practices through contact in Pacific trading centers. This cross-cultural exchange continuously enriched the global body of navigation knowledge, as effective techniques spread far beyond their original cultural contexts. However, this knowledge transfer was often incomplete or imperfectly understood. Techniques that worked well within their original cultural and geographic contexts might be less effective when transplanted to different conditions. Language barriers could lead to misunderstandings about crucial details. Cultural differences might prevent complete appreciation of the theoretical foundations underlying specific navigation methods. The result was a fascinating patchwork of navigation traditions that developed in different maritime regions, each incorporating elements borrowed from other cultures but adapted to local needs and conditions. Portuguese sailors might use star charts originally developed by Arab astronomers, but modified to account for Atlantic Ocean currents that Mediterranean navigators never encountered. Chinese navigators could adopt Polynesian techniques for reading wave patterns, but combine them with their own sophisticated understanding of monsoon timing and seasonal wind shifts. This cultural blending created some of the most advanced navigation systems in human history. When sailors from different traditions worked together on the same vessels, they often discovered that combining their techniques produced more reliable results than relying on any single approach. A ship might use Arab methods for calculating latitude, Viking techniques for reading wind patterns, and Polynesian approaches for detecting distant land, creating a hybrid system that drew on the best elements of multiple traditions. But this cross-cultural learning process also revealed how deeply navigation knowledge was embedded in specific cultural contexts. Techniques that seemed straightforward to sailors from one tradition might be nearly incomprehensible to those from another background. The mental frameworks that organized navigation knowledge differed dramatically between cultures, making it difficult to transfer complete understanding, even when individual techniques could be successfully copied. The preservation of navigation knowledge presented unique challenges for ancient maritime societies. Unlike written texts that could be copied and stored, navigation expertise existed primarily in the memories of experienced sailors. When a master navigator died, his accumulated knowledge risked disappearing with him unless it had been successfully transferred to apprentices. Wars, plagues, and maritime disasters could eliminate entire generations of skilled navigators, creating knowledge gaps that might take decades to rebuild. Some cultures developed systematic approaches to preserving navigation information. The Arabs created detailed written descriptions of sailing directions, stellar positions, and seasonal patterns that could supplement the oral traditions passed down through apprenticeship. Pacific Island societies developed elaborate songs and stories that encoded navigation information in memorable forms, ensuring that crucial knowledge could survive even if individual navigators were lost. However, written preservation had its own limitations. The most crucial aspects of navigation skill were often impossible to capture in words. The ability to read subtle changes in wave patterns, to detect the approach of weather systems through barely perceptible atmospheric shifts, or to maintain accurate dead reckoning calculations under stressful conditions, required forms of embodied knowledge that could only be developed through direct experience. The relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical skill created another layer of complexity in navigation training. A sailor might memorize hundreds of star positions and understand all the mathematical principles underlying celestial navigation, yet still struggle to apply this knowledge effectively under real sailing conditions. Conversely, an experienced mariner with limited formal education might possess intuitive navigation abilities that allowed him to bring ships safely home when more educated navigators failed. This tension between theory and practice shaped how navigation knowledge was organized and transmitted. The most effective training programs combined rigorous memorization of factual information with extensive hands-on experience under varying conditions. Apprentice navigators needed to learn not just what the stars looked like and how they moved, but how to observe them accurately from a pitching deck, how to compensate for atmospheric distortion, and how to maintain confidence in their observations when fatigue and stress made concentration difficult. The tools and instruments that ancient navigators developed reflected this balance between theoretical precision and practical necessity. Devices needed to be accurate enough to provide useful information, but also robust enough to function reliably under harsh maritime conditions. They had to be simple enough that sailors could operate them correctly even when dealing with emergency situations, yet sophisticated enough to provide the precision required for long-distance ocean navigation. The astrolabe, one of the most advanced navigation instruments of the ancient world, exemplified this design philosophy. In skilled hands, it could measure stellar positions with remarkable accuracy, allowing navigators to determine their latitude to within a few miles. Yet its basic operating principles were simple enough that competent sailors could master its use with relatively brief training. The instrument was constructed from durable materials that could withstand the corrosive effects of salt spray and the physical abuse of shipboard life. Similarly, the cross-staff and other angle-measuring devices represented elegant solutions to the challenge of making precise, astronomical observations from unstable platforms. These instruments allowed navigators to measure the height of stars above the horizon, or the angular distance between celestial objects with sufficient accuracy for practical navigation, while remaining simple enough to construct and maintain using the limited resources available aboard ancient vessels. But even the most sophisticated instruments were secondary to the navigator's trained eye and practiced judgment. Experienced sailors learned to estimate stellar positions accurately without any instruments at all, using their hands as measuring devices and their trained intuition to compensate for various sources of error. This skill was crucial because instruments could be lost, broken, or rendered unusable by weather conditions, but a navigator's knowledge and experience traveled with him regardless of circumstances. The mathematical foundations underlying ancient navigation were often more sophisticated than modern observers might expect. Calculating position from stellar observations required understanding of spherical geometry, trigonometry, and astronomical timing that represented cutting-edge mathematical knowledge for their era. Ancient navigators were working with concepts that wouldn't be formally codified in mathematical texts for centuries, yet they applied these principles routinely in their practical work. This mathematical sophistication developed through practical necessity rather than academic study. Navigators discovered geometric relationships through repeated observation and experimentation, gradually refining their understanding until they could make calculations that were both accurate and rapid enough for shipboard use. The mathematical principles they developed were often expressed in practical rules and procedures rather than abstract formulas, making them accessible to sailors who might have limited formal education. The accuracy achieved by these empirical mathematical methods was remarkable. Skilled ancient navigators could determine their position to within distances that were small fractions of their total voyage length. A navigator crossing the Mediterranean might know his location to within 10 or 20 miles after sailing for several days. Polynesian wayfinders could locate tiny Pacific islands after voyages of thousands of miles, demonstrating precision that rivals modern electronic navigation systems. This accuracy was achieved through systematic application of multiple cross-checking techniques rather than reliance on any single measurement or calculation. Ancient navigators understood that individual observations might contain errors, so they developed methods for combining multiple sources of information to produce more reliable position estimates. They might use stellar observations to determine approximate latitude, dead reckoning to estimate longitude, and environmental clues like water color or bird behavior to refine their calculations. The redundancy built into these navigation systems provided crucial safety margins for long ocean voyages. If clouds obscured the primary stars used for navigation, backup constellations could provide alternative position references. If instrument readings seemed inconsistent with other indicators, navigators could fall back on dead reckoning or environmental observations. This systematic redundancy meant that navigation could continue even when individual techniques failed or became unreliable. The seasonal variations in navigation accuracy reflected the changing relationship between Earth and the celestial sphere throughout the year. During certain seasons, the most useful navigation stars were perfectly positioned for accurate observations. At other times, the available stars might be less favorable, requiring navigators to rely more heavily on alternative techniques or to accept reduced precision in their position calculations. Experienced navigators learned to plan their voyages around these seasonal variations, timing their departures to take advantage of optimal stellar configurations. A voyage that might be relatively straightforward during spring months could become significantly more challenging if attempted during seasons when the relevant navigation stars were poorly positioned. This seasonal planning required deep understanding of astronomical cycles and their practical implications for navigation accuracy. The weather dependence of stellar navigation created another set of challenges that ancient mariners had to master. Clear skies were obviously essential for taking star sights, but even partial cloud cover could significantly complicate navigation calculations. Skilled navigators learned to work with whatever stellar observations were available, using brief glimpses of stars through broken clouds to maintain approximate position awareness, even during extended periods of poor visibility. The techniques developed for navigating during cloudy weather were among the most sophisticated aspects of ancient seamanship. Navigators learned to maintain dead reckoning calculations with extraordinary precision, using their understanding of currents, winds, and ship performance to estimate position when stellar observations were impossible. They developed sensitivity to environmental clues that could provide navigation information even when the stars were invisible. The integration of stellar navigation with weather prediction represented another advanced skill that separated master navigators from ordinary sailors. Understanding how atmospheric conditions affected star visibility allowed navigators to anticipate periods when observations would be difficult and to plan their navigation strategy accordingly. They could often predict weather changes hours before they became obvious to less experienced observers, allowing them to take crucial star sights before deteriorating conditions made accurate observations impossible. This weather sensitivity extended beyond simple visibility concerns to encompass understanding of how atmospheric conditions affected the accuracy of stellar observations. Humidity, temperature gradients, and atmospheric pressure could all introduce systematic errors into angle measurements, causing stars to appear higher or lower than their true positions. Skilled navigators learn to recognize these conditions and apply appropriate corrections to their calculations. The ability to compensate for atmospheric distortion required years of careful observation and practice. A navigator might notice that stars appeared unusually bright and sharp on certain nights, indicating exceptionally clear air that would provide the most accurate readings. On other evenings, the stars might twinkle more intensely or appear to shimmer and dance, warning him that atmospheric turbulence was distorting their apparent positions. These subtle visual cues helped experienced sailors judge the reliability of their observations and adjust their calculations accordingly. Temperature variations throughout the night created their own navigation challenges. As the air cooled after sunset, different atmospheric layers could bend starlight in unpredictable ways, causing celestial objects to appear higher or lower than their actual positions. Skilled navigators learn to recognize these thermal effects and time their observations for periods when atmospheric conditions were most stable, usually during the deepest part of the night when temperature gradients had stabilized. The moisture content of sea air added another variable that ancient mariners had to understand and compensate for. High humidity could create a haze that dimmed the stars and made precise angle measurements difficult. Salt spray in the air could create tiny crystals that scattered light, causing stars to appear fuzzy or surrounded by halos. These conditions weren't just inconveniences but actual threats to navigation accuracy that required specific techniques to overcome. Some navigators developed methods for creating artificial reference points when natural atmospheric conditions made stellar observations unreliable. They might use oil lamps or torches positioned at known distances to calibrate their measuring instruments, ensuring that their equipment was providing accurate readings despite challenging observational conditions. Others learned to use the moon's position relative to stars as a cross-check for their primary navigation calculations, taking advantage of the moon's brightness to maintain some form of celestial navigation, even when fainter stars were obscured. The psychological demands of night navigation intensified during extended voyages, when navigators had to maintain their skills and confidence through weeks or months of continuous sailing. The mental fatigue that accumulated during long ocean crossings could significantly affect a navigator's ability to make accurate observations and calculations. Sleep deprivation, combined with the stress of being responsible for the safety of the entire ship, created conditions that tested the limits of human performance. Ancient mariners developed sophisticated techniques for managing these psychological challenges. They learned to rotate navigation duties among multiple qualified individuals, ensuring that no single person carried the burden of continuous responsibility. They created systematic checking procedures that allowed multiple navigators to verify each other's calculations, reducing the chance that fatigue-induced errors would go undetected. Most importantly, they maintained absolute confidence in their traditional methods, understanding that doubt and hesitation were more dangerous than any technical navigation challenge. The social hierarchy aboard ancient ships often placed enormous pressure on the primary navigator, whose decisions could determine whether the entire crew lived or died. This responsibility required a special kind of mental toughness that went beyond technical competence. A navigator had to project confidence even when facing uncertain conditions, maintain clear thinking under extreme stress, and make crucial decisions with incomplete information while knowing that lives depended on being right. The training required to develop this psychological resilience was just as important as learning the technical aspects of navigation. Young sailors were gradually exposed to increasing levels of responsibility and stress, allowing them to develop the mental discipline necessary for critical decision-making. They learned to trust their training even when their instincts suggested different courses of action, and to maintain emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstances. The relationship between the navigator and the ship's captain created another layer of complexity in the social dynamics of ancient voyages. While the captain held ultimate authority over the vessel, he was often completely dependent on the navigator's specialized knowledge for determining course and position. This created a unique partnership where technical expertise had to be balanced with command authority, and where disagreements about navigation decisions could have fatal consequences for everyone aboard. Successful navigation teams developed communication protocols that allowed for rapid decision-making while maintaining clear chains of authority. The navigator might provide technical recommendations about course and timing, but the captain retained responsibility for final decisions about when to change course, when to seek shelter, and when to continue sailing despite challenging conditions. These partnerships required mutual respect and trust that could only be developed through successful collaboration over time. The economic pressures surrounding ancient maritime trade created additional demands on navigation performance. Merchants expected their ships to arrive at destinations on schedule, carrying cargo that was still valuable after the voyage. Delays caused by navigation errors could result in spoiled goods, missed market opportunities, or arrival at ports when demand for specific products had declined. These commercial considerations meant that navigation accuracy had direct financial implications that extended far beyond simple safety concerns. The competition between different trading operations drove continuous innovation in navigation techniques. Merchant houses that could consistently complete voyages faster and more reliably than their competitors gained significant advantages in the marketplace. This created strong incentives for investing in better navigation training, more sophisticated instruments, and improved techniques for route planning and execution. Some of the most advanced navigation developments emerged from military applications where the stakes of accurate positioning were even higher than in commercial sailing. Naval vessels needed to coordinate complex maneuvers involving multiple ships, often under combat conditions where navigation errors could result in collisions, groundings, or tactical disasters. Military navigators developed specialized techniques for maintaining formation sailing at night, and for executing precise timing of coordinated operations. The secrecy surrounding military navigation techniques created interesting dynamics in the broader development of maritime knowledge. Innovations that provided tactical advantages were often closely guarded, preventing their adoption by civilian navigators who might have benefited from improved accuracy or safety. Conversely, commercial navigation developments that proved particularly effective might be adopted by military forces seeking to improve their own operational capabilities. The international nature of ancient trade routes meant that navigation knowledge was constantly being tested against unfamiliar conditions as ships ventured into new waters. Techniques that worked perfectly in familiar sailing areas might prove inadequate when applied to different ocean basins with distinct current patterns, weather systems, and stellar visibility conditions. This constant testing and refinement of navigation methods ensured that only the most robust and universally applicable techniques survived over time. The cultural exchange that occurred when navigators from different traditions worked together on the same vessels provided opportunities for rapid advancement in navigation science. When Arabic astronomical knowledge combined with Polynesian wave-reading techniques, or when Viking coastal navigation methods merged with Mediterranean stellar calculations, the resulting hybrid approaches often proved superior to any single traditional system. However, This cultural mixing also created challenges in maintaining the purity and accuracy of traditional navigation knowledge. When techniques were imperfectly understood or incompletely transmitted between cultures, the resulting modified practices might be less reliable than the original methods. The gradual degradation of navigation accuracy through imperfect cultural transmission was a constant concern for societies that depended on maritime trade. The apprenticeship systems that governed navigation training had to balance the need for preserving traditional knowledge with the necessity of adapting to changing conditions and incorporating new techniques. Master navigators faced the challenging task of determining which innovations represented genuine improvements and which were merely interesting but ultimately unreliable variations on proven methods. The oral traditions that preserved much navigation knowledge required constant maintenance and verification to prevent gradual corruption of crucial information. Star names, calculation procedures, and route descriptions had to be passed down with perfect accuracy across generations of sailors, with no written backup to correct errors that might creep into the oral transmission. This created enormous responsibility for the individuals who served as the living repositories of navigation wisdom. The memory techniques that ancient navigators developed to preserve and organize their knowledge were remarkably sophisticated. They learned to associate stellar positions with familiar objects, seasonal events, and geographic features in ways that made complex astronomical information easier to recall under stress. These mnemonic systems often incorporated cultural stories, religious imagery, and personal experiences that helped embed technical data in memorable narrative frameworks. The physical stamina required for night navigation was another demanding aspect of ancient seamanship that modern observers often underestimate. Taking accurate stellar observations required standing on deck for extended periods, often in uncomfortable positions, while maintaining steady concentration despite cold, wind, and the constant motion of the ship. Navigators had to develop the physical endurance necessary to perform these demanding tasks repeatedly throughout long voyages. The equipment maintenance required for navigation instruments added another layer of responsibility to the navigator's duties. Astrolabes, cross-staffs, and other measuring devices had to be kept clean, properly calibrated, and protected from the corrosive effects of salt water. A navigator whose instruments provided inaccurate readings was worse than useless, since false precision could lead to navigation errors that might not become apparent until the ship was hopelessly lost. The backup systems that prudent navigators developed for critical equipment failures demonstrated the thorough preparation required for successful ocean voyaging. A complete navigator carried multiple measuring devices, understood how to improvise replacement instruments from available materials, and maintained alternative calculation methods that didn't depend on specific tools. This redundancy was essential because equipment failures during critical navigation situations could quickly transform routine voyages into survival emergencies. The seasonal preparation that preceded major voyages involved weeks or months of intensive planning and equipment checking. Navigators had to verify their star charts, calibrate their instruments, review their route calculations, and ensure that they had all the knowledge necessary for the specific sailing conditions they expected to encounter. This preparation phase was often as demanding as the voyage itself, requiring meticulous attention to detail and thorough verification of every aspect of the navigation plan. The weather routing strategies that experienced navigators employed involved sophisticated understanding of seasonal patterns, regional climate variations, and the interaction between different meteorological systems. A skilled navigator could often avoid dangerous weather by timing his departure to take advantage of favorable seasonal patterns, or by choosing routes that minimized exposure to areas known for severe storms during particular times of year. The contingency planning that prepared navigators for unexpected situations required them to think through multiple scenarios and develop appropriate responses for each possibility. What would they do if their primary navigation stars were obscured for several days? How would they handle equipment failures during critical phases of the voyage? What alternative routes were available if weather conditions made their planned course unsafe? This systematic preparation for uncertainty was crucial for maintaining safety during voyages where help was not available, and mistakes could prove fatal. The integration of navigation planning with broader voyage logistics required close coordination between navigators and other key crew members. The navigators' route calculations had to account for the ship's cargo capacity, water and food supplies, crew size, and expected sailing performance under various weather conditions. A route that was theoretically optimal from a navigation standpoint might be impractical if it required more supplies than the ship could carry, or if it exposed valuable cargo to unnecessary risks. The documentation systems that some advanced maritime cultures developed for preserving navigation information represented early attempts to create systematic repositories of sailing knowledge. These might include written descriptions of coastal features, charts showing the positions of dangerous reefs or shoals, tables of stellar positions for different seasons, and detailed sailing directions for specific routes. While such written materials never replaced the need for experienced navigators, they provided valuable backup information that could supplement practical knowledge. The verification procedures that ensured the accuracy of these written navigation aids required extensive cross-checking between multiple sources and continuous updating based on new observations. A chart that showed a reef in the wrong position could cause a shipwreck just as easily as no chart at all. The maintenance of accurate navigation documentation was an ongoing process that required the participation of many experienced sailors over extended periods of time. The standardization efforts that some maritime cultures undertook to ensure consistency in navigation practices represented sophisticated attempts to systematize what had traditionally been highly individualized knowledge. By establishing common procedures for taking stellar observations, calculating positions, and recording navigation information, these cultures could improve the reliability of their navigation systems while making it easier to train new navigators. However, standardization also created risks if the adopted standards were based on incomplete understanding or if they failed to account for regional variations in navigation conditions. A standardized technique that worked well in one ocean basin might prove inadequate in different waters. Yet, the authority of official standards might prevent navigators from adapting their methods to local conditions. The quality control mechanisms that evolved within navigation training systems helped ensure that only truly competent navigators were entrusted with responsibility for ship safety. These might include formal testing procedures, apprenticeship requirements, and peer review systems that verified a navigator's skills before allowing him to take charge of important voyages. The stakes were too high to allow unqualified individuals to practice navigation on vessels carrying valuable cargo and irreplaceable human lives. The continuous learning that characterized the careers of successful navigators reflected the dynamic nature of navigation knowledge and the constant challenges presented by changing conditions. Even master navigators continued to refine their techniques, learn from other experienced sailors, and adapt their methods to account for new observations or improved understanding. Navigation was never a static skill that could be learned once and then applied without modification throughout a career. The legacy systems that preserved navigation knowledge across generations represented one of humanity's most successful examples of knowledge preservation and transmission. Despite the challenges of maintaining accuracy in oral traditions, the fundamental principles of stellar navigation remained remarkably consistent across different cultures and historical periods. The basic techniques for finding direction from stars, calculating position from stellar observations, and planning routes using astronomical information proved so reliable that they remained largely unchanged for thousands of years. The preservation of navigation knowledge through guild-like organizations created formal structures for maintaining the highest standards of seamanship across entire maritime communities. These professional associations developed rigorous apprenticeship programs, established codes of conduct for practicing navigators, and created systems for sharing information about new discoveries or improved techniques. Members of these organizations understood that their collective reputation depended on maintaining consistently high-performance standards, creating powerful incentives for excellence and continuous improvement. The examination procedures that these organizations developed for certifying new navigators were comprehensive and demanding. A candidate might be required to demonstrate his ability to calculate position from stellar observations under simulated difficult conditions, to plan complete routes for hypothetical voyages including contingency alternatives, and to identify and correct common navigation errors that could endanger ships and crews. These examinations tested not just technical knowledge, but also judgment, decision-making ability, and the psychological resilience necessary for handling emergency situations. The mentor relationships that formed within these professional communities often lasted for decades, creating bonds between experienced navigators and their former apprentices that transcended simple teacher-student interactions. Master navigators took personal responsibility for the performance of sailors they had trained, understanding that their own reputations were tied to the success of their protégés. This created powerful incentives for thorough training and careful selection of apprentices who showed genuine aptitude for navigation work. The knowledge sharing that occurred within these communities accelerated the development and refinement of navigation techniques far beyond what individual navigators could achieve working in isolation. When experienced sailors gathered at major ports, they would compare notes about recent voyages, discuss challenges they had encountered, and share solutions they had developed for difficult navigation problems. These informal conferences served as early forms of professional development that helped spread best practices throughout the maritime community. The record-keeping that some of these organizations maintained created invaluable historical archives of navigation information. Detailed logs of successful voyages, reports of hazardous conditions encountered in specific waters, and documentation of seasonal variations in weather patterns provided future navigators with comprehensive databases of practical information. These records were particularly valuable for planning voyages to distant or rarely visited destinations where current local knowledge might be limited. The innovation that emerged from organized navigation communities often resulted from systematic efforts to solve specific problems that affected multiple members. If several navigators reported difficulties with stellar observations during certain atmospheric conditions, the organization might sponsor research into alternative techniques or improved instruments that could address these challenges. This collective approach to problem-solving produced advances that individual sailors working alone would have been unlikely to achieve. The quality assurance programs that these organizations implemented helped maintain public confidence in professional navigation services. By establishing clear standards for navigator certification and creating mechanisms for investigating navigation failures, these groups could provide merchants and ship owners with reliable ways to identify qualified practitioners. This professional credibility was essential for maintaining the economic viability of careers in navigation during periods when incompetent practitioners might damage the reputation of the entire profession. The international connections that developed between navigation organizations in different regions facilitated the exchange of techniques and knowledge across cultural boundaries. A navigation guild in one port city might maintain correspondence with similar organizations in distant locations, sharing information about local sailing conditions, regional navigation challenges, and innovative solutions that had proved effective in their waters. These connections created informal networks of professional knowledge that spanned entire ocean basins. The specialization that evolved within these professional communities allowed individual navigators to develop expertise in particular types of voyages or specific navigation challenges. Some might become specialists in coastal navigation, developing extraordinary skills for safely piloting ships through dangerous inshore waters. Others might focus on long-distance ocean voyaging, perfecting techniques for maintaining accurate navigation during extended periods without sight of land. This specialization improved overall navigation capability, while ensuring that the most challenging assignments were handled by practitioners with appropriate expertise. The technological development that these organizations supported often involved collaborative efforts to improve navigation instruments and techniques. Groups of navigators might pool resources to commission improved astrolabes from skilled craftsmen, or they might work together to develop new methods for taking stellar observations under difficult conditions. These collaborative projects produced advances that individual navigators could not have afforded or achieved working independently. The training standardization that professional organizations implemented helped ensure that navigators trained in different locations would have comparable skills and knowledge. By establishing common curricula for apprenticeship programs and creating standardized testing procedures, these groups could maintain consistent quality standards regardless of where individual navigators received their training. This standardization was particularly important for international trade routes, where navigators from different regions might need to work together on the same vessels. The safety protocols that these organizations developed reflected centuries of accumulated experience with navigation hazards and emergency procedures. These might include standardized procedures for handling equipment failures, protocols for navigation in dangerous weather conditions, and emergency techniques for determining position when primary navigation methods were unavailable. The systematic codification of these safety procedures helped reduce the risk of navigation accidents and provided clear guidance for handling crisis situations. The continuous education that professional organizations provided for their members ensured that even experienced navigators stayed current with new developments in navigation science. Regular meetings might feature presentations about improved techniques, discussions of lessons learned from recent voyages, and demonstrations of new instruments or calculation methods. This ongoing professional development helped prevent the gradual degradation of skills that could occur when navigators worked in isolation for extended periods. The regulatory functions that some of these organizations assumed included establishing ethical standards for navigation practice and creating mechanisms for disciplining members who failed to meet professional requirements. These regulatory powers helped maintain public trust in navigation services, while providing clear consequences for navigators whose performance endangered ships or crews. The threat of professional sanctions created powerful incentives for maintaining high standards throughout entire careers. The research activities that advanced navigation organizations supported often involved systematic studies of specific navigation challenges or detailed documentation of regional sailing conditions. These research projects might involve multiple navigators collecting data over several years, creating comprehensive databases of information that would benefit the entire profession. Such collaborative research efforts produced knowledge that was far more complete and reliable than what individual practitioners could develop through their own limited experience. The library services that some organizations provided created centralized repositories of navigation knowledge that members could consult for planning difficult voyages or researching unfamiliar sailing areas. These libraries might contain written sailing directions, charts of dangerous waters, tables of stellar positions, and historical records of successful voyages to remote destinations. Access to such comprehensive information resources provided significant advantages for navigators planning complex or challenging expeditions. The insurance functions that navigation organizations sometimes provided reflected the high financial stakes involved in maritime commerce. By pooling resources and sharing risks, these groups could provide some protection for members whose careers were ended by injuries, equipment losses, or other professional disasters. This financial security allowed navigators to focus on their professional responsibilities without constant worry about the economic consequences of accidents or misfortunes beyond their control. The diplomatic roles that navigation organizations occasionally assumed involved representing the interests of professional navigators in negotiations with government authorities, merchant associations, and other groups whose policies affected maritime trade. These advocacy functions helped ensure that navigation professionals had input into regulations and policies that could significantly impact their working conditions and career prospects. The cultural preservation that these organizations undertaken helped maintain traditional navigation knowledge even as new technologies began to supplement or replace classical techniques. By documenting traditional methods and ensuring that younger navigators learned classical skills alongside newer approaches, these groups helped preserve invaluable knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as maritime technology evolved. The international standards that emerged from cooperation between navigation organizations in different regions created common frameworks for navigation practice that facilitated international trade and cooperation. When navigators from different cultures could work together using shared techniques and common procedures, it became much easier to staff international voyages and coordinate complex trading expeditions that involved ships from multiple nations. The apprenticeship networks that professional organizations maintained created structured pathways for young people to enter navigation careers while ensuring that experienced practitioners had access to qualified assistance. These programs matched promising apprentices with appropriate mentors, established clear progression requirements, and provided support systems that helped young navigators develop the skills and knowledge necessary for successful careers. The emergency response systems that navigation organizations developed provided crucial support for navigators and crews facing crisis situations. These might include procedures for coordinating search and rescue operations, networks for sharing information about dangerous conditions or navigation hazards, and resource pools that could provide emergency assistance to ships in distress. Such support systems significantly improved survival rates during navigation emergencies and provided reassurance for families whose loved ones spent months at sea. The performance monitoring that these organizations conducted helped identify navigation problems before they resulted in serious accidents. By tracking the success rates of different navigators, analyzing the causes of navigation errors, and identifying patterns in navigation failures, these groups could provide early warning about developing problems and implement corrective measures before lives were lost or valuable cargo was destroyed. The succession planning that professional organizations undertook ensured continuity of navigation expertise even when individual master navigators retired, died, or became incapacitated. By maintaining detailed records of each navigator's specializations and training multiple apprentices in critical skills, these groups could prevent the loss of essential knowledge and maintain adequate numbers of qualified practitioners to meet ongoing demand for navigation services. The technological adaptation that navigation organizations managed helped their members successfully integrate new instruments and techniques into their traditional practice. When improved astrolabes became available, or when new methods for calculating stellar positions were developed, these organizations could provide training and support that helped experienced navigators adopt beneficial innovations without abandoning proven traditional approaches. The risk management strategies that professional organizations developed helped navigators and their employers make informed decisions about voyage planning and route selection. By maintaining comprehensive databases of navigation hazards, seasonal weather patterns, and historical voyage outcomes. These groups could provide detailed risk assessments that helped merchants and ship owners balance potential profits against navigation dangers. The competitive intelligence that navigation organizations gathered helped their members stay informed about developments in other maritime regions that might affect their own professional opportunities. Information about new trade routes, changing political conditions, or technological innovations in distant ports could provide valuable advance warning about trends that might impact local navigation demand or require new professional skills. The professional development that these organizations provided went beyond basic navigation training to include business skills, leadership development, and specialized knowledge that could enhance career prospects. Advanced navigators might need to understand cargo handling, crew management, and commercial negotiations, in addition to their technical navigation skills, particularly if they aspired to command positions or wanted to establish independent navigation consulting practices. The quality benchmarking that professional organizations conducted provided objective measures of navigation performance that could guide professional development and career advancement decisions. By establishing clear metrics for navigation accuracy, voyage efficiency, and safety performance, these groups could help individual navigators identify areas for improvement while providing employers with reliable ways to evaluate navigation services. The knowledge transfer that these organizations facilitated ensured that innovations and improvements developed in one region could quickly spread to other areas where they might prove beneficial. Formal exchange programs, professional conferences, and systematic correspondence networks created multiple channels for sharing navigation advances across geographic and cultural boundaries, accelerating the overall pace of progress in navigation science. The crisis management that navigation organizations provided during periods of war, political instability, or natural disasters helped maintain essential navigation services even under extremely challenging conditions. These groups could coordinate resources, share critical information, and provide mutual support that allowed navigation to continue functioning when normal commercial and social structures were disrupted. The legacy preservation that professional organizations undertook created lasting monuments to the achievements of exceptional navigators, while ensuring that their knowledge and techniques would be available to future generations. Through written records, training programs, and institutional memory, these groups could maintain connections to the greatest practitioners of their profession and continue learning from their accumulated wisdom long after individual masters had passed away. The innovation incubation that forward-thinking organizations provided created environments where promising new ideas could be developed and tested without the immediate pressure of commercial application. By supporting experimental research and providing resources for testing new approaches, these groups could accelerate the development of navigation improvements while minimizing the risks associated with unproven techniques. The professional ethics that navigation organizations established helped maintain public trust in navigation services while providing clear guidance for practitioners facing difficult decisions. Codes of conduct addressed issues such as conflicts of interest, professional competence requirements, and obligations to employers and crews, creating frameworks for ethical decision-making that protected both practitioners and the public interest. The career development that these organizations supported helped individual navigators maximize their professional potential while ensuring that the profession as a whole maintained adequate numbers of skilled practitioners. Mentorship programs, continuing education opportunities, and career counseling services provided support systems that helped navigators adapt to changing conditions and advance their careers throughout their working lives. The industry leadership that professional navigation organizations provided helped shape policies and practices that affected the entire maritime industry. By participating in regulatory discussions, advocating for safety improvements, and promoting professional standards, These groups could influence decision-making processes that determined working conditions and professional requirements for navigators throughout entire regions or trading networks. The knowledge integration that these organizations facilitated helped combine insights from different navigation traditions into more comprehensive and effective approaches. By bringing together practitioners from various cultural backgrounds and encouraging systematic comparison of different techniques, these groups could identify the most effective elements from each tradition and develop hybrid approaches that surpassed any single cultural system. The performance optimization that professional organizations supported helped navigators achieve the highest possible levels of accuracy and efficiency in their work. Through systematic analysis of successful voyages, detailed study of navigation errors, and careful evaluation of different techniques, these groups could identify best practices that improved overall navigation performance while reducing risks and costs. The wisdom accumulated by these professional organizations created something unprecedented in human history: a systematic approach to preserving knowledge that existed primarily in human memory and could be lost forever with a single shipwreck or plague outbreak. They understood that navigation expertise wasn't just individual skill, but collective inheritance that belonged to entire communities of seafaring peoples. The examination procedures these groups developed tested far more than technical competence. They evaluated judgment under pressure, the ability to make life or death decisions with incomplete information, and the psychological resilience necessary to maintain confidence when surrounded by endless ocean and dependent entirely on one's own calculations. A candidate might be presented with deliberately contradictory stellar observations and asked to determine which readings were accurate and which were corrupted by atmospheric distortion. These tests often took place under conditions that simulated the stress and fatigue of actual voyages. Candidates would be required to take stellar observations after being awakened from deep sleep, to calculate positions while dealing with deliberate distractions, and to maintain accuracy in their work despite cold, discomfort, and time pressure. The examiners understood that navigation skills that worked perfectly under ideal conditions might fail completely when tested by the harsh realities of ocean sailing. The mentor relationships that emerged from these professional structures created bonds that often transcended simple teacher-student interactions. Master navigators invested years of their lives in training selected apprentices, understanding that their own professional legacy would be carried forward through the skills and knowledge they successfully transmitted. These relationships often involved financial obligations, with masters providing equipment and support for promising students who might not otherwise have access to navigation training. The reciprocal obligations that governed these relationships meant that successful navigators were expected to support their former mentors and to take responsibility for training the next generation of practitioners. This created professional dynasties that spanned multiple generations, with navigation knowledge flowing through family lines and apprenticeship chains that maintained continuity across centuries of maritime development. The specialized libraries that some navigation organizations maintained represented unprecedented efforts to preserve maritime knowledge in written form. These collections might include hand-copied charts showing the locations of dangerous reefs and shoals, detailed sailing directions for specific trade routes, tables of stellar positions calculated for different latitudes and seasons, and historical accounts of successful voyages to remote destinations. The maintenance of these libraries required enormous effort and expense. Parchment and paper were costly materials, and the skilled scribes capable of accurately copying technical navigation information were rare and expensive. Salt air and dampness constantly threatened to destroy written materials, requiring careful storage and regular reproduction of deteriorating documents. Yet the organizations understood that these written records provided crucial backup for the oral traditions that formed the primary basis of navigation knowledge. The verification procedures that ensured the accuracy of these written materials were extraordinarily rigorous. Multiple experienced navigators would review each chart or sailing direction, comparing it against their own knowledge and experience. Discrepancies would be investigated thoroughly, with expeditions sometimes being organized specifically to verify questionable information. The organizations understood that a single error in their reference materials could cause disasters that would destroy their credibility and endanger countless lives. The updating systems that kept these libraries current required continuous input from practicing navigators who encountered new information during their voyages. Discoveries of previously unknown hazards, changes in coastal features caused by storms or earthquakes, and observations of unusual stellar phenomena all needed to be incorporated into the written records. This created feedback loops between practical navigation and theoretical knowledge that continuously improved the accuracy and completeness of the organization's information resources. The access controls that governed use of these library materials reflected the enormous value and sensitivity of navigation information. Knowledge about safe passages through dangerous waters or accurate sailing directions to profitable trading destinations could provide significant competitive advantages to those who possessed it. Organizations had to balance their commitment to sharing knowledge among members against the need to protect information that could be valuable to competitors or dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. The training programs that these organizations developed went far beyond simple instruction in stellar observation and position calculation. They included comprehensive education in weather prediction, ocean current analysis, coastal navigation techniques, and emergency procedures for handling equipment failures or unexpected situations. Students learned not just how to navigate under ideal conditions, but how to adapt their methods to whatever circumstances they might encounter during actual voyages. The practical exercises that formed the core of these training programs involved increasingly challenging scenarios designed to test students' ability to apply their knowledge under realistic conditions. Beginning exercises might involve taking stellar observations from stable platforms under clear skies, but advanced training would require accurate navigation while dealing with heavy weather, equipment problems, and the stress of emergency situations. The cross-cultural exchange that these organizations facilitated brought together navigation traditions from different maritime regions, creating opportunities for unprecedented advancement in navigation science. When Arab astronomical knowledge met Polynesian wave-reading techniques, when Viking coastal navigation methods combined with Mediterranean stellar calculations, the resulting hybrid approaches often proved superior to any single traditional system. These cultural exchanges weren't always smooth or immediately successful. Different navigation traditions were often based on fundamentally different assumptions about how the ocean environment worked, how stellar observations should be interpreted, and what level of accuracy was achievable with available techniques. Reconciling these differences required patient work by experienced practitioners who could identify the valid elements in each tradition while discarding approaches that were less effective. The standardization efforts that emerged from these cross-cultural encounters represented sophisticated attempts to create universal navigation languages that could be understood and applied by practitioners from different backgrounds. Common terminology for stellar observations, standardized procedures for calculating position, and agreed-upon methods for recording and sharing navigation information all helped reduce the confusion and errors that could result from cultural differences in navigation practice. The innovation that resulted from these collaborative efforts often involved combining the best elements from multiple traditions into new approaches that were more effective than any of the original systems. A technique that used Arab methods for calculating latitude, Polynesian approaches for reading wave patterns, and Viking strategies for coastal navigation might prove more reliable and accurate than any of these individual traditions used in isolation. The quality assurance mechanisms that these organizations developed helped ensure that the knowledge they preserved and transmitted was accurate and reliable. Systematic testing of navigation techniques under controlled conditions, careful verification of stellar position data, and thorough evaluation of new methods before they were incorporated into training programs all helped maintain the high standards necessary for safe ocean navigation. The research projects that these organizations sponsored often involved multi-year studies of specific navigation challenges or comprehensive surveys of sailing conditions in particular regions. These collaborative research efforts produced knowledge that was far more complete and reliable than what individual navigators could develop through their own limited experience. The resulting databases of information provided invaluable resources for planning complex voyages and training future navigators. The documentation standards that these groups established ensured that knowledge was recorded in consistent formats that could be easily understood and used by different practitioners. Standardized notation systems for stellar observations, common formats for recording sailing directions, and agreed-upon methods for describing navigation procedures all helped reduce the confusion that could result from inconsistent documentation practices. The preservation techniques that these organizations developed protected valuable navigation knowledge from loss due to physical deterioration, political disruption, or cultural change. Multiple copies of important documents were maintained in different locations. Knowledge was recorded in multiple formats to reduce the risk of complete loss, and systematic programs ensured that critical information was regularly reviewed and updated to maintain its accuracy. The emergency response capabilities that these organizations maintained provided crucial support during navigation crises. Networks for sharing information about dangerous conditions, procedures for coordinating search and rescue operations, and resource pools that could provide emergency assistance to ships in distress all helped improve survival rates when navigation situations went wrong. The professional development opportunities that these groups provided helped individual navigators advance their careers while maintaining the high skill levels necessary for safe and effective navigation. Continuing education programs, specialized training in advanced techniques, and mentorship opportunities all helped ensure that practitioners could adapt to changing conditions and continue improving their performance throughout their careers. The economic benefits that resulted from organized professional navigation extended far beyond the immediate advantages to individual practitioners. More reliable navigation reduced shipping losses, improved delivery schedules, and increased the overall efficiency of maritime trade. These economic improvements benefited entire communities that depended on maritime commerce, creating strong incentives for supporting professional navigation organizations. The political influence that some navigation organizations achieved allowed them to advocate for policies that supported safe and effective maritime trade. By participating in regulatory discussions and providing expert advice to government officials, these groups could help shape laws and regulations that protected navigation interests while promoting overall maritime safety and efficiency. The international cooperation that developed between navigation organizations in different regions created informal networks that spanned entire ocean basins. Information about navigation hazards, technical innovations, and training methods could be shared across vast distances, helping improve navigation standards throughout interconnected trading regions. The technological advancement that these organizations supported often involved collaborative development of improved instruments and techniques. By pooling resources and expertise, these groups could undertake research and development projects that individual practitioners could not afford, leading to innovations that benefited the entire navigation community. The safety culture that professional organizations promoted emphasized systematic approaches to risk management and continuous improvement in navigation practices. By establishing clear safety standards, investigating navigation accidents, and promoting best practices, These groups helped reduce the risks associated with ocean navigation while maintaining public confidence in professional navigation services. The legacy systems that these organizations created ensured that the accumulated wisdom of exceptional navigators would be preserved and transmitted to future generations. Through training programs, written records, and institutional memory, these groups maintained connections to the greatest practitioners in navigation history, allowing their knowledge and techniques to continue benefiting practitioners long after the original masters had passed away. The competitive advantages that resulted from organized professional navigation helped maritime communities that invested in these systems achieve superior performance in international trade and exploration. Regions with strong navigation organizations could undertake longer voyages, reach more distant markets, and achieve higher success rates in their maritime ventures, providing significant economic and strategic benefits. The cultural preservation that these organizations undertook helped maintain traditional navigation knowledge even as new technologies and techniques became available. By documenting classical methods and ensuring that younger navigators learned traditional skills alongside newer approaches, these groups preserved invaluable knowledge that might otherwise have been lost as navigation technology evolved. The knowledge synthesis that advanced organizations achieved involved combining insights from practical experience, theoretical study, and cross-cultural exchange into comprehensive understanding of navigation science. This synthesis produced approaches that were more sophisticated and effective than any single source of knowledge could provide, representing the pinnacle of ancient navigation achievement. The institutional stability that professional organizations provided created frameworks for continuous development and improvement in navigation practices. Unlike individual practitioners whose knowledge might be lost when they died or retired, these organizations could maintain and build upon accumulated expertise across multiple generations, ensuring steady progress in navigation science over extended periods. The global impact of organized professional navigation extended far beyond the immediate communities where these organizations operated. The techniques, knowledge, and standards that these groups developed spread throughout interconnected trading networks, influencing navigation practices across entire ocean basins and contributing to the overall development of maritime civilization. To the overall development of maritime civilization. And so we reach the end of our journey through the starlit waters of ancient navigation, where ordinary men performed extraordinary feats with nothing more than their trained eyes, weathered hands, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who had sailed these same dark seas before them. These weren't just sailors. They were the keepers of humanity's oldest technology, a technology written not in manuals or blueprints, but in the very fabric of the night sky itself. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll look up at the stars differently. Those distant points of light that we barely notice in our illuminated world once guided entire civilizations across impossible distances. They carried trade goods that connected continents, explorers who discovered new lands, and families who trusted their lives to the ancient dance between earth and sky. The next time you use GPS to find your way to the grocery store, remember the Polynesian wayfinder who could locate a tiny island after sailing 1,000 miles of open ocean. When you check the weather app on your phone, think of the Viking navigator who could predict storms by reading the color of the water and the behavior of seabirds. These ancient mariners didn't just navigate the seas, they navigated the very boundaries of human possibility. Their legacy lives on not just in the routes they pioneered or the lands they discovered, but in the reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated technology is the one that requires no technology at all. Just knowledge, patience, and the courage to trust in wisdom older than memory. Sweet dreams, and may your own navigation through the night be guided by stars as constant as those that brought our ancestors safely home across the endless dark waters of the ancient world.